So thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Hicks, who has graciously agreed to come down here. He is the George and Francis Ball Distinguished Professor of Economics and the Director for the Center of Business and Economic Research. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Tennessee in 1998. When you look at his CV, there's a long list of honors and prizes. And I want to mention that this goes back to 1991 when he was awarded the Bronze Star for his service in the Army. In my mind, Professor Hicks combines the best that economics has to offer. It's rigorous economic analysis and a detailed knowledge of local conditions and local institutions. So please extend our warmest Hoosier welcome to our distinguished visitor.
Thank you all. Appreciate you coming on a Saturday afternoon to listen to me. My wife and I own a small home on the Ohio River. It's a vacation home. It had 2 feet of water in it this week, so I got to escape there to be here. And so that's good for me now. That's what economists call the partial equilibrium. So I'm happy to be here now, no longer up to my knees in mud. The general equilibrium is I got to go back to face my wife tonight after being here today. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk to you. I guess I can just go ahead and walk through my outline here if this moves. There we go. Perfect. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what tariffs are. This is not my area of research. I mean, it shouldn't be anybody's area of research, like, coming up with new measles vaccines. It's an unfortunate thing to be talking with you about. I think there are more interesting topics, more things that should be salient about our futures, about our economic conditions here in the Midwest, and that I study that are a lot more exciting, but here we are. I'm going to give you a little bit of empirics about what we see, so what's been, how bad is this now, what's happened to us now, and try to make sense of it as best I can. And then I'm going to give you sort of a short economic performance. This is my first public release of a replacement of a forecast for the Indiana economy that I do every year. Normally I don't have to update it after 90 days, but here we are. And then I'm going to talk about what I think some of the long-term effects are. Some of that will be empirical, but not all of it. And then we'll talk just a little bit about a pathway out of this mess and if there are silver linings. So, humans trade. We trade based on comparative advantage. We do things in our households. That one of us does things that we're especially good at. Because we're taller, we get the toaster off the top shelf in the pantry. Or if we have better eyesight, we look for, a tick on the dog. Whatever your household problems are, you're solving them through comparative advantage. And in trade in early days, generally because transportation costs were so high, was limited to like consumer high-end luxury. So Marco Polo's adventures were about luxuries. Columbus's trip to the New World was about luxury items. He's not carrying rice and steel ingots and things like that, walking back from China. And the Industrial Revolution really sort of brought around trade in intermediate goods. Goods that could be manufactured from one place to another. And that really launched a sort of a view of the world that economists call mercantilism that apparently is alive today. And the idea of mercantilism is that nations are like a business, that you do better by selling more to someone than you buy from them. And that launched the Hudson Bay Company, the East India Company. It caused actually the tariff and tax regime and the financial constraints on the colonies. We weren't allowed to have banks here. If you want to go to Savannah, Georgia, and you ever visit the wonderful waterfront there, there's an area called Factors Walk. It's behind it. And because traders in the port of Savannah weren't allowed to do banking, They kept quasi-banking activity and people called factors there. If they actually wanted to bank or write a check, that ship had to go back to London because the Great Britain's mercantilists Parliament believed that that would lead to too much freedom here, too much economic prosperity if they were allowed to bank and would hurt Great Britain. And so that was one view of the world. And then along in 1776 came this professor in Scotland, Adam Smith, and he just shattered that idea. And he explained essentially that growth came to us through the division of labor. He's used this famous example of a pen factory that one person in the course of a day could make just a few dozen pins because he would have to start the fire and heat the metal and draw the pin out, and then somebody else would have to cut them, and somebody else would hammer the heads on the back to flatten it, somebody else would have to whiten it and sharpen it, and then somebody else would cool them, and then somebody else would stick them in cardboard and they would sell them. But if you were to get people to divide their labor, to become very good at keeping the fire going and heating the metal and drawing it out or doing each of the other parts, they could make thousands of pins a day. That was really the explanation of how trade, through trade of labor, makes us prosperous. And it was a huge, well, a lot of people don't recognize it today, but it's Enlightenment rejection of this mercantilist view. And the mercantilist view is wrong in lots of ways. It's wrong in the basic assumption that if you sell more than you buy, or if you buy more than you sell, you're going to go out of business. The American automobile industry buys the majority of its parts from other firms and then assembles cars and sells them, and they're doing okay. Toyota's doing okay. BMW, Honda are doing okay, but the idea that this prosperity comes from an imbalance of trade is absurd, and the best evidence of this is we're like 25 times more affluent than we were in 1776. The globe is about 15 times more affluent than we were in 1776, and just who is it we're trading with? Mars or Venus? So the idea of trade as division of labor is really the value, not trade as a accounting book back and forth. And at the same time we had trade, we had tariffs, and I'm going to cite Doug Irwin here. You know that one of the real reasons for tariffs, the early reasons for tariffs, was because it's the easiest way to collect revenue for government. The U.S. didn't have a centralized taxation system until 1913. Taxes, if they were levied, were asked to be levied by states, so states had to either do it on a per capita basis or some other basis of collecting taxes for federal government. So tariffs were very heavily designed to be a revenue source for us. The other reason you would have trades is to protect import substitution. That would be to prevent, if I'm producing something in my country to keep somebody else from competing against me, a very narrow focus of tariffs that are designed just to keep people from competing with Americans or in any other country, thus making that industry more profitable. There's a really good piece by Phil Magnus at Cato that lays out how much corruption this introduced, and that much of the 1913, I think the 16th Amendment that gave us the income tax was designed to end the corruption that comes with trade, because the tariff requests, the exemptions to tariffs are extraordinarily corrupting. There's an interesting paper, I think published in 1922, and the author escapes me, about showing a very strong empirical linkage between donations to the GOP and exemptions to the 2018 tariffs. I'm sure it's just accidental, but there it goes. And then the final one of these is just this domestic protection here that tariffs come up with. So those are the reasons that we have tariffs. And the question then is, why did we ever get rid of them? The reason we've really become anti-tariff is because of this Smoot-Hawley tariff that was introduced in the 1930s. There's this picture in the right-hand corner is from the 1980s movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. This is Ben Klein explaining the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the background. In that time, in 1930, trade was about 4.5% of GDP. And so it wasn't very much. Transportation costs were huge. We had a strong manufacturing industry. Manufacturing in the 1920s was largely isolated around transportation networks. So think about it first, waterways, and then railroads, and proximal to major inputs, mostly labor. I mean, the real reason manufacturing came to the Midwest is because we had this excess labor that had an 8th grade education in the 1880s because of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which required the collection of property taxes to create public schools that were common throughout 8th grade. And the farms that were settled in Indiana between 1805, 1803 to 1815, and by that time had overwhelmed the capacity of the land to sustain the population. And these were subsistence farms in the early part of the 19th century. 3 generations later, the same land grant size was available, somewhere between 40 and 300 acres throughout the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and it was no longer able to sustain those families. So if you looked at the Midwest, you saw this teeming number of young people who were going to have to leave the farm and move to urban places somewhere else. And some were going west, but most of them were looking for cities, so it was a great place to move. It also happened we had natural gas, we had a lot of railroads, we had a pretty good water system, we had access to iron ore from Canada and northern Michigan, and so this was a good place to do manufacturing. And so when we get to 4.5% of GDP with trade, that's still mostly consumer goods. It's not big inputs. Then World War I came along, and after World War I, transportation costs had dropped substantially. We were still shipping, there was still a lot of sail across the Atlantic in the 1910s. That ended, and so shipment of intermediate goods began. And so as soon as by 1929, 1930, we had the Great Depression started as a bad financial recession, and Congress, despite the fact that 1,000 economists had signed an open letter, so this is before email, so 1,000 economists signed an open letter against Smoot-Hawley. They passed it anyway, and so this is sort of the effects that we had of that. So there are several different researchers. Douglas Irwin, who I talked about, who's got the biggest book on trade, a really fantastic book if you're willing to wade through 600 and some chapters on the history of tariffs and trade. He's at Dartmouth today. He thinks his estimates from a 1996 paper are that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs caused about a 1 to 1.5% dip in U.S. GDP. So a recession level decline in economic activity, or near recession decline in economic activity. The retaliation, a more recent paper, thinks it's another 2%. So if you add up 1.5 to 2%, that's the retaliation of trade and the losses directly due to economic activity, because goods are going to be more expensive. I'll show you a graphic of this in a minute. That's a recession, but it's not the Great Depression. It's a type of recession that nobody outside of economic historians would have any memory of, that we have every few years all the time, and nobody sweats. The problem is that targeted retaliation, this is probably the country's top monetary economist, actually blames retaliation because it was very targeted against American exports, which were almost exclusively at the time agriculture, that caused the banking collapse in much of the Midwest. And then that banking collapse spread across the United States, and it led to a lot of New Deal programs to prevent bank runs. It gave us, great myths about bank runs and It's a Wonderful Life in 1946. So still 20 years later, people were still thinking about it. 15 years later, still thinking about it. And those estimates are then that the financial fallout from Smoot-Hawley contributed maybe half or more of the depth and the duration of the Great Depression, which at its peak was 24% unemployment rate amongst non-farm employees. which were just almost exclusively white men. Pretty bad business. The good thing about this is that Congress, that we don't know exactly how bad this was, even with very good empirical capacity today. But the blame of the American people was placed firmly on the protectionists. Congress, with only 48 states at the time, lost 97 Republican House seats and 12 senators in the 1932 election and swept FDR into place. There were only 4 more years where the Republicans held either of the 2 houses before 1982, and only one of those was because of Eisenhower's election. So this really clobbered the GOP for a century. At the end of World War II, and I should say, I have a column coming out next week. One of the points is that there are arguments for tariffs. The strongest one is that it can prevent bad guys from doing worse things. So it's a national security argument. The problem with that is the empirics are so poor in this. There's very little evidence it works. So the one place that we did this most vehemently was against Japan in the 1930s. We were very concerned what Japan was doing in Manchuria. So in addition to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, we did other protectionist things. We wouldn't export to them, and that didn't work out all that well. And so that's the argument, the national security argument on this. From 1934, with the beginning of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, up until 2018, trade barriers in the United States just dropped. So here is the trade-weighted average tariff, or we'll call it the average effective tariff rate. So that's the tariff rate on all imports because it varies by country and by commodity. And so you can see Smoot-Hawley was about 20%. You can see that by the 1934 legislation that enabled GATT, 1947, or that was 1934, 1947, the GATT was signed by almost every country in the developed world, and trade barriers have been slipping. There's an important moment in there in 1962 where Congress said, one of the things we might want to do in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis is give the president the capacity to do an immediate tariff on a country for national security reasons. So we don't necessarily have to embargo a country like we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or try to blockade them. We could do non-military interventions before that. And it's been used on a few occasions. Most recently, before 2018, George W. Bush used the Article 32, Section 232 of the Trade Act to put some steel tariffs in place. Those lasted about 90 days. And so if you look where we are now, there are 3 points here. Before 4/2, before the Liberation Day, which is a week ago last Wednesday, we had tariff rates that were about 10%. Those were tariffs that had gone up from nothing on January 19th. 4%, 3% in January 19th, up to 10%. That included tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Those are our 3 largest trading partners, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. On 4/2, that took us to like 28%. My estimate here in Indiana, based on just the manufacturing sector, had us at about 23%. So these are as bad a tariffs as we've ever had. These are as restrictive. Instead of having 4%, 4.5% of GDP in trade, it's now 13%. So 13% out, 13% in, roughly, 13 to 13.5%. So trade is a very large part of our gross domestic product. And if you look at what's happened, this is just, and it's probably a really small font, this is all the stuff that's happened in the last few months, And there's no historical example of this sort of frenzied policymaking during a normal peacetime event. Gerhard and I were talking that we entered on January 19th of this year. I actually gave a forecast, I think, on January 18th or January 17th, where I said, I expect the Indiana economy to grow at 2.1, 2.2% this year, slower than we would like. The U.S. economy about 2.4 to 2.7%, slower than we would like, but we're at a point of purging the inflationary shock of the post-COVID period out of the economy, so we're in a soft landing. I expected 37,000 more jobs here in Indiana in my forecast model, and so here we are, doing this just absurd sort of policy interventions. And if you look at the indices of policy uncertainty, which includes things on trade or just overall economic policy uncertainty, we're well past our peak threshold of COVID or 2008. There's just nothing in this. It's that unprecedented. So that's sort of what I think the problem is. So into my data. So what's this look like? So I've done some empirics here. This is a tariff shock that looked at U.S. data from 1982 to 2024. And we looked at what happened to the U.S. automobile market when there was a tariff in China. I included Chinese-U.S. trade currency exchange rates and our trade balanced exchange rates, and then overall interest rates that would account for the cost of capital if you were borrowing to buy a car. And so this is the shock that we got in 2018 using a lagged model. So it took about 9 months in Indiana after because that's our biggest industry is automobile and auto transportation parts. That's why we're doing this. It took 9 months from the 2018 announcement of tariffs, which were delayed. They didn't actually come into play until July. So from the announcement date, we peaked our manufacturing employment growth, which had been sustained at that point for about 9 years, and reversed course. We lost 10,000 factory jobs in 2019 throughout that full year. We were on rate to lose about another 10,000 in 2020. But COVID came along, so we missed that, what looked like a manufacturing recession in 2019. And so that level of loss, if you just look at the productivity of the average auto worker, if you lose 2.5% auto sales, we would lose about 10,000 workers here in Indiana. So that's just a quick empirical estimate that we use to try to help some state folks who are trying to judge the budget forecast for the coming year. Here's a second look at this. This is a look at the effect of nominal disposable income on auto and light trucks. And again, we're looking at auto and light trucks because here that's what we do in much of Indiana, particularly north of I-70. We're a large auto and truck manufacturing. Manufacturing is not our biggest industry, but it accounts for about 16, 17% of employment. About 30% in rural counties and more like 9% in urban counties. So it's really a rural phenomenon. By the way, ag's about 1.5% or 2% in rural counties. So there's no rural county where manufacturing isn't more important than manufacturing. There is more important than manufacturing. So again, this is just an impulse response. What would happen if there was a shock of disposable income? And that just tries to capture what we think are the risk of tariffs, which are higher prices. So that's sort of a historical look at what tariffs would do to us, what they have done to us. Let's kind of look at really how bad things are here in Indiana. This is just a table of about 90 countries using the April 2nd data. So these are the most heavy exporters. And let me, if I can, walk over here and point to a couple of things and try to show you what's going on. So these are all in $1 million. There are 3 different sectors of manufacturing. So let's look at Ireland, $10 million in 31, $30 million in manufacturing 30 billion, so 10 million, 30 billion, 1 billion in manufacturing 33. There we're facing on April 2nd a 20% tariff rate. And the next big importer is from China. And by the way, these are manufactured goods. So they're 85, 90% of these are inputs to American automobile manufacturing or other manufacturing. Yeah, they would include some non-auto parts here. So if we buy a BMW from Germany and it comes to us, that would be in that. But I just assumed roughly, almost all of that was going to be captured by those things. And so in this sector, overall, and I'll show you the math in a minute, that's about $100 billion worth of inputs with about I think a 22% tariff rate on it. And so if manufacturers in Indiana, this is the most recent data, made $127 billion worth of stuff, that's their value added. So if you subtract out all the stuff we get from other states and all the stuff that we get from other countries, it's about $127 billion. So that tax rate, I'll show you this in a minute, is extraordinary. It's about, as I'll show you in a minute, about 40% of our full manufacturing wages here. Now, the president on Wednesday changed his mind. And he changed his mind. He said, we're going to cut all of these down to 10%, to the lowest rate that we had anywhere, with the exception of this one. And this one we're going to jump up to 145% total. So markets went ecstatic for about 6 hours until people got out their spreadsheets and they said, let's do the math on this. This is China, so that's 7 billion. So 8.5 billion, 9 billion. 145% of 9 billion is what, $14 billion? So that's the tariff on that. The rest is about $91 billion at 10%. So the actual tariff rate on manufactured goods coming into Indiana rose last Wednesday. It didn't drop. So that's why bond markets remain in flux today and why the stock market remains down for the week. Let me just show you some more of those empirics there. This is just a gut check on how right my forecast might be. So this is what I said. So manufacturing GDP, almost $130 billion. And again, GDP measures our value added in Indiana, and we subtract out the stuff we buy from someone else, whether or not they're in Illinois or Argentina. And we're really good at that. The compensation of employees is about 40% of that value added. So we have workers here that are being paid a very large share of that. The other 60% mostly goes to capital because there's not a lot of raw inputs in that. So that's the factory. They have about a $75 billion gross operating surplus. Their taxes are about $2.7 billion, 2%, the fourth lowest in the country. When they cry about business personal property taxes, they're paying the fourth lowest. Tariffs, about 20 now, the new tariffs are about $22 billion. $22 billion. Anybody have an idea what our annual state tax revenues are to pay for everything? $24 billion. So this is a federal tax. It's roughly equivalent to the full amount that we spend in a typical year to do everything in this state. To pay for Ball State, to pay for IU, Purdue, all our state universities, all our schools, all our Medicaid contributions, all the state police, all the $1.9 billion of road work is roughly equivalent to that. So this is the biggest tax increase on Americans in history by any measure, proportionate, magnitude, of course, adjust for inflation as economists always do. Not politicians don't always do, but economists always adjust for inflation. There's no way that that's not the biggest tax increase on Americans. And it's a little bit higher in Indiana than some states, although we're below what I think the national. I'm just looking at manufactured stuff. I didn't look at our consumer durables, which would get our rate up higher. But I'm very concerned because such a large share of our economy is in manufacturing. So the question I'm sure you're asking is, what's this going to do to our economy? Well, let's see. So Yale has a very good budget lab. Ernie Tedeschi is an economist there, was in the Council of Economic Advisors before. And they've got this effect of what they think the effect's going to be they have a large micro simulation model of the effect of national tax policy or budget changes on individual households, because we like to see, economists are very concerned about the distributional effect. Who's paying this tax? Who's paying this sort of thing? And so this is their short term, and by short term, you know exactly how long that is. It's at least 3 or 4 quarters. It could be 2 or 3 years. This is their short-term effect by household, quintile, and income. So the lowest income is not paying very much. The highest income is paying, about $9,000 a year. If I were to flip this by income category, the heaviest proportions falling on those bottom 3 or 4 quintiles. So the dollar value of the top 10% of Americans is higher. The proportion of household disposable income is higher for poorer households. So that's about 80,000. The average family is about 80,000. They think about 4,400 is the median family. And over the long run, which again, we don't know exactly how long that might be, a year or 2 years. I'm going to try to confine my comments to the rest of 2025 in the empirical part. That's about 4,400, about out of that $80,000. That's about a 5 or 6% cut in real income for Americans because of higher prices due to tariffs. And if you take these data and you simulate in the earlier models that I had on the auto industry, that's about an 18% decline in automobile manufacturing. And we've been there before. We've had spikes, big 18% spikes. 2008, we had an 18% spike. That was an interesting year. Financial crisis and people bought 20%, roughly 20% fewer automobiles. We had this in 1982 with high interest rates and a big spike. Of course, it was more difficult to defer purchase of cars in 1982 because, well, we had less good cars. But that's a major downturn right there. In the long run, that drops to 2,700. So this is a one-time shock that has a really big short-term effect, but in long term, we're still talking about 2.5% of household earnings evaporated as a consequence of this tariff in the long run. So it doesn't generate slowly. It's a one-time shock. The wealth effect, which we'll talk about later, is about $16 trillion so far as of yesterday. We'll talk about how big that is. So it's a one-time negative shock. We'll equilibrate out of that, but that means that however wealthy Americans are in the future is going to be permanently down by about 2,700. So we may catch back up with ourselves in 5-6 years at this rate. So that ain't going to happen. There's no way. We have an election in 2 years. There's absolutely no way in hell that if that happens, that we're going to have tariffs weeks after that election. This is fairly similar to what we saw in the 1932 Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and we're going to be experiencing it rather more quickly. This is my forecast. The blue is what I said, that's the forecast I gave on the 18th of July in Muncie. I'm sorry, the 18th of January in Muncie. 2.2%, 2.2, 2.1, pretty straightforward glide path of an economy where you would expect over the next 6 months 50 basis points, two cuts for 50 basis points in the Fed, some belief that inflation would subside enough for the Federal Reserve to have some capacity to stimulate the economy. This is, again, the Indiana economy. U.S. economy was higher. Growth rate 2.6, 2.7 these first 2 quarters, dropping a little bit later on in the year. Still not that's a good year. It's going to particularly look good next January. And this is my forecast now, that in first quarter growth stopped. GDP Now forecast, which is the Atlanta Fed's measure of leading economic or coincident economic indicators, looking back at their predictive power, has us at roughly 0. It's within the margin of error of 0. By summer, it's going to be 2.8%, and then a loss of 4.1% in fourth quarter. So this is a rolling effect, in part because one of the things that buoyed first quarter were advanced purchases of likely tariffed items. So we saw manufacturing sales, the supply managers index and other measures of that just skyrocket in January and February as these tariffs were announced. They're reversing now. Ships are turning around. If you can believe that, we're turning ships around, which is like what the enemy navies were built to do, to keep ships from getting to your shore with tradable goods. And that's going to have an accelerating effect. The price effects that we're first observing were very modest. It's very difficult to raise prices in largely competitive firms. If you want to go out and get French wine at Big Red Liquors, I don't think they sell it here, it's mostly Everclear, but if you want to get French wine at an off-campus location, it probably isn't going to be more expensive. It's going to be 20% more expensive in a month or two as those tariffed prices come along the board. And guess who else is going to follow that? That wine from that province of Walla Walla, Washington, because if their competitors are now 20% more expensive, they're going to follow suit as well. Plus, they're probably getting corks and bottles from overseas. So that's GDP, that's our gross domestic product. This is a pretty rough recession. Growth declined by in excess of 3% annualized over the year. Pretty tough recession. This is labor markets. So what I originally had forecast was that Indiana would grow about 37,000 more jobs in 2025, a little bit slower than in last couple of years because labor supply growth is more muted than it has been in past. Our 70% of our population growth last year was due to immigrants. That's going to stop in roughly terminate in 2025. So that will leave us with 9,000 natural birth and about over death and about 4,000 domestic migrants. So our population growth will drop by about 75%. That be reflected in labor supply, will not be as heavy as it will have been. I'm expecting manufacturing to shed about 20,000 jobs by the end of the year. I'm expecting overall employment to drop by 55,000 by the end of the year, and the unemployment rate with a static labor supply to grow to near 6% by the end of the year. Now, I still think people are going to enter our labor market. There's natural growth in it, and so that's a bit optimistic. Folks, I got to tell you, all forecasts are wrong. My forecast is wrong. The downside risk from this forecast is orders of magnitude higher than the upside risk of being wrong. So I haven't talked about any of the other stuff that's occurring simultaneously with this, but I can this is an extraordinarily bizarre turn of events that we wish we weren't talking about. So this is going to be a difficult year. If we end the year in Indiana with 5.8% unemployment rate, I'm going to drink my last bottle of French champagne. So that will be that we had a really optimistic, a much better year than I think the risk would be. It's very easy to introduce other variables into my fairly straightforward modeling. So there's no trade uncertainty in this modeling. It's the highest ever. There's none of that. This does not yet presume any retaliatory tariffs. We have very few of those being done. Right, it's a bizarre assumption, but there it is. Who's going to be targeted with these retaliatory tariffs? Any idea what trade International Economics 101 says you do? So if you ask the normal person in the street, well, if they put a tariff on my car parts, I would want to put a tariff on their car parts. You go, no. You don't want to do that. You want to find the group of people who are the strongest political supporters of the pro-tariff folks, and you want to put the hammer on them. Right? You want to just, and the reason for that is those retaliatory tariffs also hurt the other countries. So some countries are going to be very loath to do this. Vietnam doesn't want to do this. They're a desperately poor country that just wants to trade. They don't want to do anything else but trade. They've been at war off and on for the last 75 years. They just want to trade. Now tariffs are 46 or 10%. It's going to be 46 in 90 days. They don't know. They have no capacity to have leverage over that stuff, so they're not going to tariff us in retaliation. The European Union is. China already has. Canada will. Mexico certainly will. All of our largest trading partners, where we're most reliant on customers, they're going to hammer really hard. When this happened last time, through retaliation, China not only put retaliation on soybeans, but they spent a lot of money developing the soybean industry in Brazil, which has now caused our domestic exports of agricultural goods for the first time to be lower than our imports. So they hammered the soybean market. That's what's going to happen again. So foreign countries are going to say, I'm going to hammer the American markets in places that cause the most pain to the Americans that are supportive of the president's tariffs, and that minimizes pain on my citizens. And I'm going to ask, or at least accommodate, if there are subnational tariffs like this is possible in Canada, for them to do the same. So expect like 100% tariff on Teslas. Expect targeted tariffs on states, and particularly agricultural exports in states that are red states. So if you've watched the news, you've seen bourbons leaving one of the silver linings on this, the bourbon's going to get really cheap in the next few months because Canadians are no longer buying it. When people think, oh, that's not a big deal, I say, you know what was the biggest emerging tea market in 1772? Does anybody know? The biggest emerging tea market in the world. The most tea drinkers, fastest growing country is the 13 colonies. And they put a big tariff on it, and we threw that crap into Boston Harbor and have never become tea drinkers ever since. My wife is, but she's unpatriotic, so. It really is that's a cultural shift. So you could imagine that there are going to be permanent anger in some places that do cause a permanent shift from that. So that sort of makes us think about what's the long run of this look like. You know, as tariffs stay in place, markets equilibrate, households are going to substitute away from foreign manufactured goods, which unfortunately is mostly domestic manufactured goods too. A Toyota Corolla that's manufactured in Indiana or Tennessee has about 30,000 parts in it. 10,000 of those come directly from overseas. Another 20%, so another 5 to 10,000 parts are assembled from some parts overseas. Many U.S. autos are 50% foreign that are manufactured here. And so some of these will have multiple tariffs. Some of those products in past have come through this extraordinarily integrated market. In fact, you can't tell, there's nobody at the Subaru plant in West Lafayette or the Toyota plant in Gibson County or the Honda plant in outside of Batesville or Greensburg or the assembly plants in Fort Wayne who can tell you where those parts come from. There's no person there. There may be somebody at a corporate headquarters, there may be a consultant that has a good idea, but there's absolutely nobody in those plants who knows where all those things come from. The magic of markets brought them all together, not the magic of an accountant deciding where everything should be. And so all of those are going to reorient. We don't know how much that's going to happen, but the uncertainty there is sufficient that I don't know how anybody would bring to a CFO a plan to onshore American production, because you don't know, look at these tariffs going to be here in 90 days. If I'm going to build an automobile plant, that's a 3 to 5 year endeavor. Semiconductor plant, about 8 years. A wiring harness plant that's got 80 guys and gals in it, that with a little bit of capital, maybe I could put that together in 18 to 24 months. Who's going to make a 24-month investment in the United States to onshore that production in this environment? Does anybody think that Congress is not going to have right now, if it was a blind vote in Congress, these tariffs would be lifted by 75 votes in the Senate and 390. I mean, Josh Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene would be the only two that voted against these. Jim Banks probably would too, right? So if it was a blind vote, if it was a secret ballot, this would be an overwhelming vote against these tariffs to overturn that Article 32 or the Section 232 enabling legislation in the 1962 Trade Act. And so there's not going to be any. We're going to see stop work. We're going to see orders unfulfilled. Major European countries have already declared force majeure on their sales to the United States. Jaguars turned a boat around in the Mid-Atlantic full of Jaguars. And to think, I need to replace a 2008 Honda Pilot, and I was hoping for a Jaguar, but that thing's now out of reach entirely. We think about this as a tax on manufactured goods. The United States actually has a trade imbalance the other way with services. You know, always laugh, we have a trade imbalance on manufactured goods, but on services like financial services and higher education and making movies and doing healthcare, our trade imbalance goes the other way. So all of those nasty woke sectors are actually very productive. And if you want to destroy the trade tariff, just don't let people come here for education. We seem to be doing that. Prices are going to hit those services well, and so it's good to sort of walk through the transmission mechanism of prices from a tariff. So the tariffs are, I haven't talked about this, but tariffs are generally going to be paid by American consumers. And if there are tariffs from poor countries, they're going to be exclusively paid by American consumers. So from Vietnam, they're coming here, and the reason is they can't squeeze those people anymore. You know, the thing about a business that's in international trade, it's very unsentimental. If they could have squeezed out a little bit from their supplier, they would have done so already. They weren't waiting for the president to declare a tariff. They were getting all they could out of them. In a more developed country like Canada, they're going to pay more like 50-50 of the tariff. The problem is we're the most developed country in the world, so we have the least price elastic demand for goods, so we're going to pay over half of all the tariff that's American consumers. So a 20% tariff on Canada, we'll probably pay 15% of it, 12% of it, and they'll pay the rest. That's why some of the retaliatory tariffs aren't going to be extraordinary. They're going to be very targeted. But then they're going to spill over into services. And the way you think about this is there's sort of two ways this happens. The first one is, I love, is auto insurance. So if it's 12 to 15% more expensive to buy a car, and that's sort of at the current level with substitution away from China, then it's 12 to 15% more expensive to buy a car. Your insurer is going to hike prices, and they're going to hike those prices this summer. So, you know, in the next few months, you should expect your insurer to increase the insurance costs on your automobile. The prices are going to go up for Canadian softwoods, which are providing the majority of the building material for homes in the United States. Now, with mortgage interest rates now clocking over 7% in a big reversal of a 2-year downward trend, the demand for those softwoods are going to drop, but they're going to be more expensive. So if you have homeowners insurance to replace your home if it's flooded, or if you have a tornado, if you have a fire, that's going to go up probably more like 5 to 7% because of the composition of that. It's going to then affect your Uber Eats driver who's got a car that's delivering your Uber Eats. So it's going to be a little bit more expensive to do that. Your healthcare stuff, a lot of that's imported materials. The cheap stuff's going to go up. So, there's a big hospital monopoly in Indiana, so IU Health probably isn't going to bump their prices up, but your providers are going to. It's going to be more expensive to buy some of that equipment. Most of it's made in the U.S., but it's made out of materials that are now more expensive. Steel's going to be more expensive, because the American steel industry now knows that they can raise prices by 24%. There's a 25% tariff, and nobody's going to run away from them. So you're going to see that happen, and it's going to happen substantially in the long run. We have spent the last 80 years building global supply chains with other liberal democracies that we agree with on most things, how countries run, the rule of law in international affairs, the primacy of the individual rights, market freedom, those sorts of things. They're being fractured, and they're being wooed now by people who are our adversaries. China, for example. Russia isn't going to do anything much, but China certainly is working hard to build those relationships in other places. I think it's going to take a generation of solidity to replace that. And they also know our weak points. We haven't talked a lot about that, but the bond market stuff that I'm about to talk to makes it pretty clear. And if a spy had snuck into somebody's bedroom and got the news that the President of the United States would drop his signature economic policy over a little bit of rocking of the bond market, and that I own $800 billion worth of American bonds, they would have given her the hero of the Soviet Union medal for that piece of intelligence. It was extraordinary. So this was a really great week and a half for China's long-term desire to be a major global power, and a really bad one for the people of the United States. What have we maybe missed that I haven't talked about? I talked to Gerhard about it. I'm not a monetary economist. I found that to be amongst the most boring things in graduate school, and wish I wasn't talking about it. But bond markets exist as a safe haven for people, and they expect liquidity in it. So if I'm seeing volatility on stock market, what I'm going to do is move my money into bonds. So last November, I rebalanced my retirement portfolio away from stocks into bonds to get ready to retire, but that day is now more distant than ever. And the reason we do that is because particularly American U.S. bonds, Treasury bonds are very secure. Because the world transacts much of their economic activity in dollar denominations, countries hold them. Oil is bought and sold in U.S. dollars. We're the reserve currency of the world. And so the reason we do that is our economic system has built us, we export a lot of security. So we export a lot of goods, we export a lot of services, but we also export security. That doesn't come into the national income accounts, but that would balance. The reason we're able to run a trade deficit is because people are willing to flow into our currency to pay us for that security. If we included security and national strength as part of our national income accounts, we would have a balanced trade already. That's going away. So on Monday, if you looked at the bids, the auctions on the stock market were outnumbered the purchases, the sells outnumbered purchases by several orders of magnitude. So nobody was willing to buy stocks on Monday. That's why stocks went up instead of repeating the third 4.5% decline of October 1929. It bumped as people weren't buying declining stocks, and they were buying stocks that they thought would be safe havens in tariffs. And then that night, and then especially Tuesday night, and the bond market is more important overseas because it shows international trade in this, that started showing liquidity concerns in the sense that people were leaving that market and there weren't buyers. And so that what caused our long-term borrowing rates to go up. It's not huge yet, it's not financial crisis yet, but after Tuesday night, second night of that, the president said, we've finally figured out that there are people scared about a real full-blown financial crisis in the United States. It's not over with. Normally, when we have had financial crisis, we've had lots of warning bells in the weeks and months in advance of them. This is a really big warning bell. And both stock and bond markets have been in decline over these past few weeks, particularly the bond market, because of liquidity concerns. In other words, if I can't get my money out of a market that's in decline, I'm going to pull it out and put it where I can, just into something that I think is safer. And normally the U.S. bonds are the safest place to put them. If they're putting them in banks instead of U.S. bonds, or they're buying another country's bonds, that's very painful for exchange. So if you think about what's going on in U.S. manufacturing and 2 or 3 large sectors, we're petroleum, we're the largest petroleum manufacturer in the world, biggest exporter. Aeronautics and military equipment were big producers. And so the acquisition model for all of the U.S. defense industry goes something like this. I make this super high-tech piece of equipment that can defeat everything on the battlefield, and I update it for 20 years with every new piece of technology until it's so damned expensive that America just says, enough. The Department of Defense says, enough. We're going to buy a limited number of these, and we're going to replace our existing stock with those. That's almost I worked for the Air Force for 3 years. That is the story of defense acquisitions. And then I'm going to sell them on an individual basis to Americans at a little bit lower cost than my total cost, because I'm going to get to sell them to Europeans and other countries years and years and years later, because none of those guys have to fight us. They have to fight that bad stuff that the Russians have built. And so the defense sector model, which is a huge industry in the United States, has just lost a 1950s and later strategy, because Europe's not going to buy that stuff from us anymore. They're going to build their own. They're not going to rely on us. And so you've already seen the F-30. 2 countries have canceled their F-32 fighter. If you hold stock in any aeronautics industry right now that's providing those component parts, it's now plummeted. It's horrific long term for that. The wealth effect. All right. So what I say, I did this on Wednesday. It was about $12 trillion. 12 to $16 trillion estimate of total wealth decline. So it's equivalent to what we lost in 2008, the peak of our wealth decline. I just saw an estimate yesterday. And so the working model since the 1970s has been that the wealth effect is associated with about a 5% decline in consumption. So for every $100 loss in wealth, there's about a 5% or a doubling of loss of, I'm trying to say this right, the elasticity is about a 0.05. So a 1% loss of wealth, about a 5%, or a 100% loss of wealth, about a 5% decline in consumption. So if you just look at the numbers, then that's 16 trillion of wealth out of a $27.7 billion or $trillion economy. That translates in about a $800 billion decline in consumption. Now, there's been some research that says, well, it's not that big. It only really matters if people perceive it as a permanent loss of wealth. If it's a transient loss, they don't really change their consumption patterns. But if Americans withdraw that $800 billion worth of spending this year, that's 2.5% of GDP. That makes my forecast way off, way off. That forecast does not include that. We may have really underestimated upward price pressures as a consequence of this. So we think about the effect of tariffs on prices. We affect the pass-through of tariffs. It's so massive now. It affects every store has stuff made in China in it. Every manufactured item has something made in from some imported product. We may really have missed the inflationary effects. It doesn't have to be linear. So if you just add up the tariffs and you figure out what the extra price is, maybe it's 12 to 15% of a car. But what if that really unleashes strong effort by those automobile manufacturers to raise their prices? So if we're wrong about that, then that just makes whatever the Federal Reserve might wish to do with monetary policy to make this a less damaging recession far more difficult. States are going to balance budgets. They've got to balance budgets. And so if Indiana faces a 4.1%, so for the next budget, I projected in that earlier slide close to a 4% start in 2025, decline in GDP. That's going to be at the high end, so we have a very inelastic, very responsive taxation system that's going to really clobber state tax revenues. So whatever the budget is going to be voted on, we'll see next week what the new budget forecast. It was produced yesterday. It'll be delivered in session next week. What it says about next year, I expect the state's going to cut back on everything they said they were going to spend money on. Higher education, K through 12 education, Medicaid spending, you name it, they're going to use some of that money because the forecast is going to be worse than at the start of the year. And again, if I'm a foreign trade partner, if I'm Canada, I think Trump is crazy. That's not Hicks's opinion, that's not my area of expertise. But if I'm a Canadian exporter or importer of America to the United States or elsewhere, I'm thinking this guy's crazy. But that's only half my problem. 49% of Americans voted for him. So if the liberal international order of trade and cooperation has been shattered and it's supported by half of Americans, I'm not really sure that a détente with China is a bad idea. Are there silver linings to all this? Well, I gave this talk to my students on Thursday, and we're about to raise a whole generation of free trade fanatics. And we've done this twice before. We did it in the 1830s when we cut tariffs after they really constrained agriculture in the U.S. We did it in the 1930s and 1940s. I just heard a great anecdote from Gerald Ford when he exited college in 1940. He was a football hero, and he was a staunch America First Republican, and then he had to leave home and go fight on a ship for 4 years. And when he got back, he was a modern Republican, right, at least from 1945 to 2015, where he supported free trade, and he actually won his first congressional seat running against an America First Republican in a primary. So if I'm really optimistic, this is where Americans, we learn lessons slowly but well, and this is really what we're doing right now. A lot of people believe, I think it's quite a fantasy, that we could return manufacturing employment to a golden age, that there was a golden age of factories that were where America was better and healthier and life was better. That's always been just crap as an idea. I mean, the mercantilist idea was debunked in 1776. And let's think about intellectually what other stuff we were bubbling around in our heads in 1776. Scientific consensus was the world was about 4,000 years old. Charles Darwin's birth was still a half century away. There's no germ theory. If you got sick, we needed to bleed you to let the bad ethers out of you. All right? That was the intellectual environment when mercantilism was destroyed as an idea. So here we are back at it, that we've got to return to something different. I mean, the U.S., when I was born in 1962, 32% of Americans worked in factories. About half of all men worked in factories. Factory towns were a big deal. And I try to tell people, does anybody know when the peak manufacturing production in the U.S. was? Anybody know? I think it would have been this year. It was last year, the year before. Depending how you measure it, we could be 1% lower than we were in 2007. Other measurements are 4, 5, or 6%. But nobody really disputes that we're right at the peak of our manufacturing production in inflation-adjusted terms today. We're the second biggest manufacturing country in the world. We're beaten only by a country that has about 4 times the number of our population. Right? And they barely beat us. And they're trying to beat us. Now, does anybody know what year manufacturing employment peaked? I remember it well. The Bee Gees were top. It was 1979. In Indiana, it was 1973. The reason we don't have a lot of factory jobs is we're really good at making stuff. Have there been job displacements due to foreign trade? Absolutely. We stopped doing a lot of things that were low wage, low productive work, in part because workers in those industries were not signing on in a second generation for it. It's really easy to have African Americans in South Carolina or Tennessee do a very large garment industry in the 1950s and the 1960s. By the 1970s and 1980s, something had happened. For some reason, the children of those African Americans who didn't get a chance to go to high school were actually well educated and moving into other sectors. So we got rid of doing the bad factory jobs, and we started doing the good factory jobs. And by the way, it's not just us. That's true across all the globe. Chinese manufacturing employment peaked some time ago. It peaked in the 1990s in Mexico. So everybody else is getting good at it too. There was never a manufacturing golden age. And we think about, well, income was more equally distributed, not, unless you were a woman or unless you're African American. The 1950s, I don't remember them, but there may be reasons why the 1950s are nostalgic. They had better cars or nicer cars, and maybe the music was a little bit better. But that was it. There's nothing economically that would suggest that we could or should return to that. Again, I hope the tariffs were going to clobber the political economy. So we're going to raise a generation of free traders. And if we have an unemployment rate here in Indiana of 6% at the end of the year, again, which that's optimistic, because that doesn't look at retaliatory tariffs. It doesn't look at the wealth effect of the stock market losses. It doesn't, that unemployment rate doesn't account for any growth in labor supply. It could easily be 7 or 8%. If that happens, tariffs are going to be tarnished as an idea for a long time. And again, I don't think anybody legitimately believes these tariffs are going to be codified in the next Congress. And crises tend to unify people who didn't think they needed to think about these things before. I often tell people there are 3 types of people who supported the regime that said they were going to do tariffs. There were some that said, I don't believe he's going to do tariffs, so I'm going to vote for him. There were some that said, I want tariffs, I think they're a great idea. And then there was a bunch of people who said, I don't know what a tariff is, right? I guess there could be a 4th that voted him for some other reason. But this was his salient, this was his primary economic reason. So each one of those positions are stupid in their own way. And the question is, how do you decompose the stupid for those? And it's not and again, I mentioned a Gerhardt, and I'll end. On Monday, I was called by NPR to talk about this. The work that I did on trade in 2015 was actually cited in Project 2025. There was 998 pages of that, 26, 27 chapters. There was one chapter that actually had a pro and anti-trade argument made in it. And Veronica DeRugi, who's an economist at George Mason, cited my 2015 paper on trade in that argument in support of trade. So I'm one of the economists that was in that Project 2025 saying we should have trade. That gives you an idea of where the Republican Party really is on that trade. Again, if it was an open debate, nobody would do this. If it was a sealed vote, nobody would do it. And so on Monday, when the NPR reporter called me and said, now you've given me the progressive argument on trade, could you tell me who I should talk to for the conservative argument on trade? I said, ma'am, I just gave you the Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, David Ricardo argument on trade. There is no progressive argument. There are 1,000 economists signed a letter in 1929 or 1930 against Smoot-Hawley. That's the conservative argument for trade. And so it's easy to talk about the paucity of thoughtfulness in this administration because it's not an ideological issue. There is not a closed form argument for this issue. And with that, I'm done. Feel free to get a hold of me in any way you want, and I'll take your questions. I got a few minutes for a question. Yes, sir.
I I've heard this mentioned, the chicken wars of trade, I guess 60 years ago. What exactly was that, but it was used as an example of it's hard to get tariffs off?
Okay, so free trade agreements, and you saw a bump in tariffs. Let me see if I can go back up to, you saw a bump in tariffs in the 1950s. And so once the whole globe started reindustrializing after World War II, a number of countries made the argument that I have an infant industry. And that infant industry needs protection so that it can grow domestically. And so that was the argument for maybe putting a tariff on imports into Germany or Japan. Those countries were reindustrializing after World War II. And so they placed tariffs on the United States, said, wait, hold on a minute, we just paid for you to reindustrialize, so you're going to put tariffs on it. So there was a brief sort of shock of trade wars in the 1950s, and those were largely gone by the 1960s. And I won't go back up to that tariff map, but even that still had trade level or tariff levels that were well below where we are now. So what trade agreements do, essentially, there should be no problem negotiating. You could just say, I'm not going to have any tariffs. But that's not politically tenable because there's always somebody who's got some favored industry that has argued for a tariff to protect them. So all of tariffs have devolved into these protecting domestic sectors. So what every country sort of does is the trade agreements really cause you to say, I'm just going to limit my tariffs to these 13 out of the 7,000 commodities that we trade. And you can have your 13 or 15, and Mexico can have their 13 or 15, and Indonesia can have these few. Everybody else, we're just going to leave it at zero. And so the trade agreements are really pressure on your own domestic legislature not to do what we've just done to ourselves. So that's a trade war. Yes, sir.
So where are we with China? And is it, I mean, it seems to me impossible to keep where the state of, I mean, basically it's an embargo against each other, right? That we, I mean, is there any trade I mean, you can't just shut trade off with China because whatever your numbers were, was it 34% like in Indiana that we get?
Yeah, well, no, that was the tariff that was originally on them on April 2nd. It's now 145%. Right. And I don't know what they said, 84% for us. I think they're playing games with us. Yeah, it's essentially equivalent to their Navy preventing any ships going to our western ports and vice versa. So
they aren't going to raise them anymore because they said it's a joke now.
Right. But at 84%, it might as well be 1,000,000%.
Doesn't it have to change because can our economy take that because we're so dependent on China, at least in the short term, aren't we?
Well, probably 2% of our imports. It's not nearly as big as in the short term, it's extraordinary because these are parts that have to be redone. So in the long term, it would be okay. In the short term, a lot of things will just not get purchased. You won't be able to buy tube socks from Walmart or T-shirts from Walmart until the Bangladeshi 10% tariff factory opens up and you can produce those. And that's going to take many quarters. So I don't think it's sustainable. I can be honest with you, I don't think it's sustainable. And so I actually retired from the Army. I was chief of plans for U.S. Army Japan. So I was a chief planning officer for a war with China. It doesn't involve tanks. Nobody thinks there's going to be tanks involved. So all this, we've got to have heavy industry to fight the Chinese under any argument is absurd. There's no plan anywhere. I haven't been there 15 years. I'm not telling you anything that's classified. There's nobody would plan to fight a war with China. It's going to be fought with satellites and with AI and hacking and that sort of stuff if we do that. So the sort of defense-based argument of that just doesn't hold. I think we're in for a very deep recession in the short run.
Best Buy practically lose all their products.
Right. If you want a large screen TV, buy it today, right? Because those are going to be unobtainable. It's going to take years for some of those to, and we had very high tariffs on substitutes like the Taiwanese manufacturers. And so it's just stunning to me that we would have done something like that. And I don't, that's partly it's very difficult to give a forecast how, the question isn't these tariffs are going to end, they're going to end. The question is how much damage is it going to take to get us there? And to me, the unemployment rates that I just gave for you should be enough to have radically changed this. But maybe Americans have appetite for a 10, 12% unemployment rate before they do this. It's all together. The model for 2026, I won't show you. Because I can't, because it's not a believable thing that this will still be around, because it's a policy choice. It's not a financial shock. It's not a war. It's not a supply constraint on petroleum. It's not, it's a policy choice. And if the policy choice may cause all those other bad things, but that's where we are now. I had a question here, and then you, ma'am. Yes?
Yeah, the U.S. debt, it's $36 trillion, something like that. And most of that is in the form of federal bonds that people have bought, like China owns a lot of it. What happens if they decide they want to start selling?
Well, that's what they did this week. So they in the first Trump administration, they had directly about 1.4 trillion in debt. I don't know how much they have indirectly, because individual companies may own it that are just quasi parts of the state. And they started dumping our bonds Tuesday night, Monday and Tuesday night, a little bit Monday, heavily Tuesday. And we don't know, because we don't know who owned these bonds in real time. They just get auctioned off. And so there's no like secondary federal data source that would tell you who sold these bonds. But once they started selling them, and they were selling them, and they're not selling them all at once because they don't want to collapse the value of their existing bonds, right? So they don't want to flood the market and kill themselves. They want to slowly flood the market. But it was bad enough that the Bank of England on Thursday stopped a sale of bonds. They didn't add any to the supply of bonds because they didn't want to sell bonds and have people leave U.S. markets to do that. So if that happens, our borrowing costs are going to spike. So right now, about 12% of our tax dollars are going to pay the interest rate on that debt. And so, it could double very quickly if our bonds if there's nobody to buy our bonds, then we have to raise the rate on those bonds to the point where somebody will lend us money. So I don't think we're at great risk of that in the short run, but, and there's only 800 billion or so in the Chinese treasury, but if everybody else, there's nobody happy with the United States out there. There's nobody who's happy over this. I mean, there's an island in the Antarctica that has penguins on it. They're not going to dump any bonds with us, but they have a 10% tariff on them. And so who knows what other country, there may be countries who think it's in their best interest to dump U.S. bonds. And the problem is I don't think there's anybody who thinks it's in their long-term interest to help save us, although the Bank of England did.
What happens if nobody wants to buy them?
They drop to zero value, and at some point you'll buy it because they'll be junk bonds. They'll give you a huge rate of return for holding them.
And the rate of return is money that the U.S. is paying to that bondholder?
We are in our tax. Yeah.
Payers.
Right. So they went up 25 basis points this week. That's a couple hundred, $300, $400 billion a year in extra debt service for the new bonds.
Now we're paying off on what we owe.
Right. So essentially, our credit score is going bad, and so the rate on our credit card's going up. Let me answer your question and I'll get to you. Yes, ma'am.
So you said early on that one of the results of tariff is political corruption. Have you factored that into your predictions about what might
I have not. That would mitigate the short-run effects. Because if everybody's willing to, if I could get out of losing $4,400 this year, I'd give a couple $100 to donate to somebody, which I might, but it'd be in a political campaign, which I've never done before. Some of the 2018 tariffs were heavily corrupting in the sense that they weren't nearly as bad as we thought because so many companies got out of them. So I just looked today, and it appears that the president has now said, well, I'm not going to tariff laptop computers or consumer electronics that are cell phones and stuff. So somebody got to him. That's small scale corruption, but it really gets corrupting when the person responsible for this, and again, the corruption in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s were just direct payment to somebody. Here it's, you contribute to something that I want, or you appear with me on TV saying how great I am, then you'll exempt my stuff. So that would mitigate the short run effects. Of course, it would damage the long term effects because, you know, the trust that we have in the economy is what keeps it going. If you lose that trust, if you no longer believe that the rule of law is controlling exchange, then the cost of capital goes up. You know, you're less likely to expand in the United States. So it's a very bad long-term effect. Yes, ma'am.
What happens if the Federal Reserve starts buying bonds?
Well, the Fed can buy a lot of bonds, and they would do that to inject money into the economy. The problem that the Federal Reserve has, they had their dual mandate. Their dual mandate is to keep the inflation rate low and the unemployment rate low. And this isn't really inflation. These higher prices are not inflation because inflation affects both prices and wages. This only affects prices. So if you were unhappy with the Biden era inflation, this is going to be order of magnitude worse because there's no coincident or lagging wage growth in it. If anything, the other overall wages will be lower in a year than they are today because so many fewer people will have jobs. There'll be less people leaving jobs to better paying jobs because of uncertainty. And so the Federal Reserve's got a real problem. Do you buy bonds? Because if you buy those bonds back, you put money in the economy, that stimulates the economy. It also juices the price level. So they could build into the price level, so they could add inflation onto the higher real prices from this tariff-induced shock to real prices. So the Federal Reserve's they're going to be thinking really hard. I don't want to cause inflation, and I also don't want a lot of people to lose their jobs. So I think what's going to happen is they're going to have to just accept both higher unemployment and higher inflation over the next year if they step in. But there's a lot of incentive to say, look, I'm not doing anything because this is this isn't a bank run, this isn't a banking failure, it's not a mistake in commodities, it's not a war that sinks a bunch of ships carrying oil, it's not something that I was designed for. I'm not designed to get the American people out of bad policy choices because we have a Congress that can do that. That's what their role in the economy is. So I think the Federal Reserve is going to be very reluctant to go, which is why I think Jerome Powell is going to get targeted to be fired.
Can he be fired?
I don't think so, but we'll see what the Supreme Court says. He still has to then fire all the other economists to get to there. So.
Room for one more question, please.
Anybody else out there? Let me go right back here, and I'll stick around and answer your questions after. Yes, sir.
It wasn't too long ago that you were giving talks on the effect of the pandemic on property taxes in Indiana. It seems to me like this is also going to have some pretty massive impacts on property taxes in Indiana. Can you talk a little bit about some of the pressures that this is going to be potentially having on housing markets, property taxes for Hoosiers, things like that?
Oh, hell, I don't know. Here's my suspicion is, home values are going to come down this year. Market values are going to go down because interest rates are now, mortgage interest rates 7%. So if we go into a recession and yet we have high foreign, normally my niece is trying to buy a home in Florida. She lives in Sarasota, she's an accountant there. And so I said, look, honey, you saved your money for 3 or 4 years. You're super smart. The interest rates are going to come down because we're going to be in recession next year. Little I know, we'd also have a coincidence, which would mean mortgage interest rates should drop. There are going to be more people, distressed homes, willing to sell their homes. Now would be a good time to buy a home. I still think it's going to be a good time to buy a home because people are going to be distressed selling. They're going to be trying to get out from underneath it. The problem is that with mortgage interest rates are rising because of the potential sovereign debt risk and that's expressed in our bond markets, that she's going to be paying a 7-8% mortgage rate when she thought she might be down in the high 5s or low 6s. So that alone is sufficient to cause there to be a glut of housing. So in our models that are run, these mass appraisal models in Indiana, that's going to generate lower property taxes, not for next year, but for fiscal year 2026 pay 2027. So I would see that on household property, the property for farmland is going to be lower because it's expressed as commodity prices, and guess who they're going to target with retaliation? It's going to be our corn, our soybeans, and our pork are going to cause farm prices to drop. And then on manufactured products, they're doing it on the book value of their capital. They could move capital out of the state. And they're a little bit more linked to it, but I would expect property tax rates, our assessments to drop, and then rates to bump up to the top simply because local governments are going to be stressed next year, particularly since the state's going to also cut. They're going to have a lower budget for the next 2 years in the biennium. So if you thought the property tax debate was cool last week, wait till they get their forecast next week. I don't know what it is. I'm just telling you, I know what it should be. And I'm happy to stick around for any more questions you want to
I
have.
want to say thank you. So my wife and I went out yesterday to get you a little market basket of goods as a token of our appreciation. And since this is
Are they all French?
no, but we did much better than that. Since this is a session on trade and tariffs, we made sure we have one good from Australia, Italy, Costa Rica, Germany, Mexico, Thailand, Canada, China, and France.
That's spectacular.
And we did this last night, so the increase in the prices would not bust our budget. And I hope they help you out when you still have to clean up your flight.
Yeah, I did. I'll bring it home. My wife, I won't be in trouble
This
anymore.
is actually kind of heavy, so we're just going to leave it right here. So thank you all for coming. I hope you learned a thing or two, and if you feel encouraged after this information and this perspective, perhaps you can call or write your elected officials to perhaps influence policy. After all, this is a democracy. Democracy thrives on our participation in the political process. So please feel emboldened to make your voices heard. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.